Hello, I'm Andrew Bacevich, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
By the way, the inaugural, hopefully successful testing of the new tent studio, the thus unnamed tent studio, and Colonel Bacevich, in this case, you know what it's like. I'm out here in the field as your spy reporter on the ground in my little GP Tiny, which really kind of is what this is. It's a little bigger than a GP Tiny, but you know, I'm looking forward to these conversations. I've had a lot of people on who talk about international relations, and to get all of you experts on and to agree about things is just about impossible. I had former ambassador to NATO, Robert Hunter, on the show, and I asked him about foreign policy and who was the last good foreign policy president. And this guy, he's worked for the Clinton administration, and he said, I'm going to be honest, and it's going to surprise you, but I think it's George H.W., and no one since has really had the chops going in to figure it out in the time that they had. You know, not that they couldn't do it, but it's a hard job to prepare for. What's your thought? Like, who was the last good foreign policy, international relations president?
Well, if we take the post-Cold War era, and George H.W. Bush was the first president of the post-Cold War era, he certainly was the best of the lot. That in a way doesn't say much. That is to say, he did a better job than Clinton or Obama or Trump. Now, if we widen the aperture, if we would say, let's say, since the beginning of the 20th century, who would I give high marks to? I think I'd have to say Franklin Roosevelt. But with a caveat. When Roosevelt became president in 1933, although he was a seasoned politician, and during World War I, he had served Woodrow Wilson as an assistant secretary of the Navy, so that was an introduction to national security issues. He certainly wasn't elected to be a foreign policy president. He was elected to be the president to get us out of the Great Depression. And if we look at his first, broadly speaking, both of his first two terms, or at least first term and a half, foreign policy was pretty much an afterthought. It's only when you get to around 1938 or so that he comes to recognize the danger posed by the rise of Nazi Germany. And in many respects, abandons what had been, to use a term that I dislike but is used frequently, he turned away from a policy of posture of quasi-isolationism to recognize the reality of us confronting Hitler. But that was fairly late in the game. But nonetheless, to get back to your question, I think that if you look at Roosevelt from about 1939 to 1945, pretty darn good job.
Are we still isolationist at all? Is that even
no? No. I mean, if you want to talk about, we've never been. It's a total fiction. It's a mirage. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I know I'm a minority voice in this, but you say to yourself, hey, wait a second. 1776, we declare independence. We're 13 little colonies that now have become states,
right?
Huddled up along the eastern seaboard of North America. No army to speak of, no navy to speak of. Pretty fragile. Most of the continent is occupied by Great Britain and France, even after the Revolutionary War is over. So we're a pretty weak little country. Poof! 1945. We're the strongest and richest country in the world.
Yeah.
You say, well, how'd that happen? Well, isolationism is not an answer. What happened was, to my way of thinking, an opportunistic strategy of expansionism. That is to say, a succession of presidents, beginning with George Washington, undertook an effort to increase the power and wealth of the United States of America, and also, not so incidentally, the territorial expanse of the United States of America. Opportunistic because they didn't really have some kind of a set strategy. There was no 10-point plan about how the United States is going to become a wealthy and great power. But it sure the heck happened. And isolationism cannot possibly describe that process. Now, when people talk about the danger of isolationism, they tend to refer to that period right before Pearl Harbor, from around 1938 to 1941. And it is certainly true that American public opinion during this period of time was deeply divided over whether or not the United States should intervene in the European war that began in 1939. And that's when we've got the charge of isolationism tends to be sharpest. But I think what gets lost in that is any kind of an understanding of why the anti-interventionist Americans didn't want to enter the war against Germany. Now, there is a charge that says that they were anti-Semites, and that it was because they were anti-Semites they were reluctant to enter the war against Germany. Now, there were anti-Semites in the anti-interventionist camp, no doubt about it. Charles Lindbergh, probably the most famous and influential leader of the America First movement, was an anti-Semite. It does not follow that everybody else who didn't want to go to war against Germany was an anti-Semite. And indeed, I would argue strongly that the people who didn't want to go to war in, let's say, 1939 or 1940, their attitude was mostly shaped by their perception that we had done this 20 years before when we entered the war against Germany in 1917. That war was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. It was supposed to end all wars, and it turned out to be a total failure from a U.S. point of view. I mean, it worked for the French, it worked for the Brits. It did not work for the United States of America. And I think there were many Americans 20 years later who said, hey, man, we don't want to do that again. And that is the principal motivation. But so were they isolationists? Well, you can call them that. You could also call them people who had drawn from history their own conclusions.
When you look at our improbable rise, and maybe it's probable because of our landmass and the openness and who's next to us. I mean, you look at China as our great adversary today, and maybe it's Russia, but let's say it's China. It's got way more people, but that's a problem because they've got a huge middle class and they can tear themselves an exploding huge middle class, bigger than our entire nation. And they demand things, and they can tear their country apart internally quickly, even though they have a 100-year plan. They have way more neighbors to deal with and oppress or collaborate with than we do. Is it important to have a 50-year plan? Or is it sort of like being nimble is the better way, or is it somewhere in between?
It's probably some of both.
Yeah,
and I think it is some of both. In other words, it is useful to have a long-term vision of what you're trying to achieve. But it's also then necessary to be able to adjust and adapt as circumstances change. I don't know if the Chinese will demonstrate that ability. They do seem to have demonstrated an ability to define a set of ambitions and then to muster resources on an enormous scale in pursuit of those objectives. But I think you made an important point, and that is the rise of China, particularly the economic rise of China, has transformed the. I'm speaking about things I really don't know about it, but it's transformed the mindset of the Chinese people. They are now into consumption. They are not necessarily into revolutionary sacrifice.
right.
I think there's a tendency on most of us as observers of China to not appreciate the possibility of China running into some really tough times. One problem is going to be likely to be demography. You know, they have more of an aging population than we do. I think that's true.
Yeah.
Another problem is likely to be the environment. Globally, there is an increasing awareness of the consequences of doing damage to the environment. And that has led to an environmental movement of lots of people saying, "Hey, wait a sec, we have to do something to reverse this damage." From my reading, it appears that the environmental problems that China faces may be on a scale far greater than we're trying to do. So where does that lead? You know, what happens when when the last tree is cut down and the wind is blowing the soil away? I mean, I'm overstating it, but I think that we shouldn't assume that China is going to have smooth sailing as it continues its efforts to become more powerful and to become wealthier.
I would even submit that it gets even more impossible. I mean, if environmental focus is a focus that requires resources, good or bad, you know, the correct choice, the incorrect choice, stability, as you know from your military time and from your studies, stability is an extraordinarily tough thing to maintain. I mean, that we argue our way to a shitty solution that pushes us down the road in a way which,
hey, you know, who would have imagined that we would be struggling with challenges to stability, to challenges to our constitutional order? 20 years ago, people would have said, "Oh, come on." But I do think I wouldn't want to overstate it. It's not time for panic. But obviously, our country is deeply divided, and I think, in particular, some of the language that President Trump uses when he, says things like, "If I lose, that proves that the entire electoral process was fixed." Well, that's really dangerous because there's a lot of people out there who will take him seriously.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of baiting going on in the political and the media, and that's both sides. When I look, and we won't go down the whole Donald Trump road, but I think it's important to note, because he is a president, and we're talking about history here. When you legislate through EOs, you are legislating in future instability, because when the next party comes, they'll wipe all that out.
Yep. I mean, and he's not the initiator of that.
Absolutely not. That's why I was like, preface that whole thing saying, like, this is a growing problem. Okay, so when it comes to international relations and foreign policy and all these things, and with your tanker hat on, I want to talk to the tanker, the colonel of you.
I mean, I'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, but I have been out of the Army years longer than I was in the Army.
Sure.
I barely know what a tank looks like. So, again, ask the questions you want, but my whatever I once had in terms of military expertise is now faded. It's from another millennium.
Yeah. No, understood and fair. It's fair to say. I guess my question is, we're seeing stories about nations, Great Britain being the latest one, say, hey, we're just not going to do tanks anymore. Are those past millennia weapon systems, even if you make them better over and over again, are they becoming obsolete in terms of international relations? I mean, do we need multiple brigades of tanks or artillery or whatever it's going to be?
Well, I mean, tell me what the next war is going to look like, and then I'll tell you. And that's the problem. We don't know what the next war is going to look like. So, if you would imagine a scenario leading to a conventional, not using weapons of mass destruction, a conventional conflict with Russia. Russia invades Poland. Why they would do that, I have no idea. But Russia invades Poland. And if still a member of NATO, the United States is going to respond to that active aggression, yeah, tanks would be useful. Conventional field artillery would be useful. You know, again, if there's no use of weapons of mass destruction, the decision might in that war might actually be determined by events on the ground. What's the likelihood of that scenario? Probably not very great.
Right.
Do I personally think the United States needs to defend Poland? No, I do not. I think that the challenges to our security, the ones that we really need to pay attention to, are unlikely to see a large-scale use of conventional ground systems.
In your most recent book, The Age of Illusion: How America Squandered Its War Victory, one of the things it talks about is the post-war folly, the delusions culminating in the age
post-Cold War.
I didn't say that. Okay, sorry. Account of the post-Cold War follies and delusions that culminated in the age of Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely agree. Like, Iraq turned out to be folly. Afghanistan was folly. Everybody, how many corners did we turn in Afghanistan as we tried to?
Right.
It just
Light
gets
at the end of the tunnel. I can see it now.
Yeah. Another bomb. More of this. Anyhow, the whole point of this part of the conversation is does anybody know what to do, whether it's combat related or diplomacy related? I mean, you look at the State Department and its job. We have 5,000 people. That's a brigade for the entire world. And then a lot of the talking to State Department people, a lot of the countries we're partnered with have enormous staffs just to deal with us because we're such an invasive partner.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody know what they're doing?
Well, they think they know what they're doing. In other words, the end of the Cold War brought into full flower a mindset about our predetermined role in the world. I mean, this was already sort of developing, evolving, burbling away during the Cold War. Cold War ends, and political elites conclude that history has rendered a great judgment, and the judgment is that we're the sole superpower, and the judgment is that the rest of the world is supposed to be like us. Now, I'm stating it in a very crude way, but I think what I'm saying is essentially correct. We thought we were going to run the show. We thought we were going to run the show, number one, because we believed that the end of the Cold War demonstrated that there was only one viable system for organizing society, and that was liberal democratic capitalism. All the other alternatives, fascism, socialism, communism, had been exhausted. So it was incumbent upon other nations to recognize that there was only one way to go. Secondly, political elites concluded that if there was anybody reluctant to sort of get with the program, the United States military would provide the necessary discipline to maintain order and to push others to embracing liberal democratic capitalism. And in the 1990s, there were always a few people who were dissenting. I was dissenting. But there was a very strong consensus in the policy world revolving around those two propositions: the inevitability of our way and the supremacy of American military power. Then comes 9/11, and 9/11 certainly shows that there are at least some people who are not willing to embrace liberal democratic capitalism. And guess what? They figured out a way, despite our great military power, to inflict a devastating defeat right in the heart of our media, financial, and political centers. And I think this caused on the one hand, it caused great panic. On the other hand, it inspired some, particularly neoconservatives, to say, here's the opportunity for us to fulfill the promise of the promise of the end of the Cold War. We are now going to put to use that power that we have. And we're going to make it abundantly clear to everybody that we're number one and that our way is the only way. And they say, well, how should we begin to do this? So, should we invade Mexico? No, no, no. We're going to invade Iraq. Afghanistan was always a sideshow. We're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow the Saddam regime. We're going to put in place a liberal democratic order in Iraq, favorable to the United States, sympathetic to the United States. And that's going to set in motion this project. Because once we succeed, the architects of this project, once we succeed in Iraq, it will become abundantly clear that further resistance is, pointless. And therefore, other recalcitrant regimes will fall in line. Iran, Syria, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. I'm not suggesting that after we invaded Iraq, we were going to invade all these other places. I am suggesting that the architects of this so-called strategy believed that a decisive victory in Iraq, which they counted on, would send a clear message to others in the region that further resistance was pointless. And then they didn't get the decisive victory. They got a war that dragged on and on and on.
Yeah.
Enormous costs in American dead and wounded, in Iraqis dead and wounded and displaced, trillions of dollars expended. And that whole project, having obviously failed, then was quietly abandoned. So you don't hear people talk about the global war on terrorism much anymore. But it kind of sort of continues. Now, we still have U.S. troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq and in Syria, and they're still fighting bad guys. Just yesterday, this morning, I saw a videotape of in Syria, of some U.S. military vehicles, MRAPs, these big sort of armored trucks, playing bumper cars with the Russian equivalent, with Russian military units.
Yeah.
And I said to myself, who is doing what? Why? There's no clear answer.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that once this global war on terrorism was exposed as purposeless, it continued anyway. And since roughly 2008, 2009, we have been at war with actually nobody having any clear understanding of why we're at war. As the neoconservatives who were really in the saddle for 3-4 years after 9/11, say what you will about them, they did have a strategy. That thought process that I described. Right. I mean, on the one hand, it was lunatic, but on the other hand, it was a strategy. If we had indeed won that decisive victory in Iraq and quickly converted Iraq into a liberal democracy, maybe everything would have panned out. So they did have a strategy. I would argue that probably since the time that Obama became president, we haven't had a strategy. None. Zero. Certainly President Trump doesn't have a strategy. And to me, it's not amusing. It's not funny at all. It's disturbing. So here we are in 2020, yeah. On the verge of an election, and nobody talks about those wars. I was reading Biden's convention speech. And the last thing he says, the last sentence in his speech at the Democratic National Convention is, God protect the troops. He didn't say what we're protecting the troops from. Nowhere in his speech does he talk about where the troops are or what they are doing. Nowhere in his speech does he talk about, when I'm president, here's what the troops will do or won't do. He never talks about that. But he gets to the end and says, God protect the troops. I think that was illuminating.
Yeah.
Because nobody wants to talk about these wars anymore. Because we don't know why the hell they're continuing.
When you look at all of these things as a system, you know, I think a lot of these things break down. First of all, we fought these insurgencies, and this is just from my repeated experience on the ground, watching us have no tether, no significant and repeatable tether to the strategic or theoretic outcomes. Because you're right, the neocons, George Bush's plan on paper for Afghanistan is wonderful, except for we didn't do the things at the ground level that would enable that vision to work out, and so it really became folly.
Do you think we, if the vision was, we're going to overthrow the Taliban, we're going to install a pro-Western regime in Kabul,
right,
and we are going to, teach, guide, counsel, coerce Afghans into embracing liberal democracy. Do you think that was ever plausible if we had done things differently?
We never trained like it was important.
No. I'm asking if we had trained the right way, do you think it was within the capacity of the United States of America in the 21st century to go into Afghanistan and transform it along lines that we chose? Was that ever possible?
I mean, phrased in that way, no. I mean, it's a very narrow scope that we could do.
But that was the idea.
Yeah. Well, and also like they proposed like that, and you and I are both critical of the Bush doctrine. He talks about freedom. Everybody wants it's a universal value.
Right.
But how do you define
freedom as we define it? Freedom as we define it.
Because I had a guy tell me I have freedom now, and then within a minute of that said he had just beat his daughter because she was on the roof too long hanging her laundry. And I'm like, that's not freedom. And he's like, that's freedom to me. And so, yeah, given your question with those realities, no. The money we spent over there, I talked to a dude in Baghdad. He said, I can literally light the dirt in my backyard on fire because there's this oil oozing out of the ground. You guys have spent over $1 trillion at the time. Why don't we have a high-tension electrical power grid going through our country? Like, if you're going to spend money, start there. And then I had another guy ask me a brilliant question, and all these things kind of line together. Like, how long would your country stay stable? How successful would you be without electricity? And I'm like, oh, if there's a chance that a blackout hits us, we lose our minds, you know?
Right.
And so when we do look at these things, these impossible things, we don't even think about that. We start with let's make their police good, and literally right. I'm on the ground asking, would you ever call the cops for anything? And I don't ask that question, but I ask the question, like a researcher would, and I can't get them to say the police will do it. So then I take that to the colonel.
We go and say, well, we're gonna eliminate corruption. Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, what is going on in people's minds when they say the United States Army, as an occupying force in Afghanistan, is going to set up a task force that is going to eliminate corruption from the Afghan government? I guess with some very specific exceptions, Japan and Germany after 1945, it doesn't seem to me that occupying forces have a whole hell of a lot of influence unless they're willing to resort to extreme forms of coercion, totally discarding considerations like the rule of law or moral values. I mean, if you're just willing to go basically kill them or lock them up. I'm not sure that foreign military forces really have much leverage. Not just ours, anybody else's.
Yeah.
You know, the Russians didn't do too well in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
They lost.
They lost.
And we thought, well, they lost because they're Russians, because they're crude. You know, they're not us. And I don't know how we would compare their losses in Afghanistan to ours. I mean, they ended up losing their whole empire. But it didn't seem to me we've done much better.
Yeah. And it's funny because there are other things that happen, again, on the ground. So we're there, I'm in Afghanistan, and we're talking to the Afghans, and they're like, how come the Russians are here? Because their vehicles keep driving over people, and we don't like that. And we're trying to figure out what the hell they're even talking about, because there are no Russians in our district. And then we figured it out. It was the Romanians, and they had Russian-looking trucks.
It's part of the great NATO.
Yes, exactly.
ISAF, whatever it was called.
Right. And so you have this problem that you can't even fathom. And then you say, no, that's not true. Another example of this is in Iraq, the Tuwaitha nuclear lab. We all know that was blown up, by the Israelis. But if you ask the Iraqis there, they say the Iranians did it. And you can't convince them otherwise. So here you don't even understand like the complexities of how hard it is to nudge people forward. Foreign policy becomes very hard.
Right.
When you go in and you take American weapons out of Poland, as President Obama did, apparently he doesn't understand that the Poles despise the Russians, and that takes and then the Baltics up north, they all go, wait, what a second, hold on, and these things confound the problem, and it seems like. And I want to get back to your book and talk about this. And this is kind of my lead into that. By the way, if you guys can hear the lawnmower, I apologize. We're working through the technical parts of recording outside. If we gave away the victory from the post-Cold War era, from World War II and all that, is it in part because we were good and we get credit for creating a stable Europe? I mean, Yugoslavia break apart aside. For the most part, Europe has been wonderfully stable the last 80 years, and I would say historically so. And so and this kind of goes back to the big Chinese question, because all of these places have autonomous things, and they're all trying to, they're now going in a new direction. Is it just impossible to manage?
Is what impossible to manage?
Well, just the European stability and how it grows, and you don't want to have, escalating troop strength and all those things, but you also want to allow Holland to prosper.
Well, I think the place to begin answering your question is to recall the conditions that existed at the end of World War II. What we then called Western Europe was devastated as a consequence of the war, to include the western part of Germany that we were occupying. The devastation, I think, was not only material, but it was psychological. These were countries with proud histories. France, Belgium, UK, that had been overrun, devastated, bombed, were now flat on their ass, desperate for assistance. And we stood up and we said, we will assist you and we will protect you. And that was timely, generous, and very much in our own interests. But let us remember that one of the reasons that the relatively cooperative relationship between ourselves and the Western Europeans flourished is because of the Soviet Union. West Germany. Take your choice. You want to be friends with the Soviets? You want to be friends with the Americans? Easy choice. So there was a set of circumstances that existed. What we called the Cold War was a set of circumstances that facilitated the successful economic and political rehabilitation of Western Europe. And again, it was a great triumph of American statecraft. But it wasn't just because we were so smart. It was because Western Europe needed help. And also because the Soviets were there hovering in the East, looking pretty darn threatening. Now, I think we actually exaggerated the threat. I don't think Stalin ever intended to march west to the English Channel. But Stalin's intentions were not honorable and they were not friendly. And therefore, it was prudent on the part of the Western Europeans to forge this partnership with the United States of America. All of that said, the conditions that existed in 1945 don't exist anymore. So why should they turn to us for protection, the Europeans? They are manifestly able to manage their own security, and they ought to do so. I mean, Russia is a problem, but good Lord, I believe I'm correct in saying that the GDP of Russia, which is a country that stretches across, 8 time zones? The GDP of Russia is equal to the GDP of Italy. You know, they are a power in decline. But we prefer to think of them as the heirs to the Soviet Union, as if Putin is Joseph Stalin, and he's not.
The lawnmower is really loud on my end right now. I'm hoping that we'll see what happens. Yeah, it's one of the listeners is saying, well, okay, we hear the problems, but what about the solutions? But I think the solutions are a problem as well, because we don't have the ability to pick an answer. There's no, I mean, there are no silver bullets when it comes to foreign policy.
But okay, wait. So we have been hearing about the problems. Let's talk about some solutions. What are the problems? That is to say, what are the problems that pose a threat to the safety and well-being of the American people? I'm assuming that you and I care about the safety and well-being of the American. Doesn't mean we don't care about the safety and well-being of people who live in Kenya.
Sure.
But mostly we care about the safety and well-being of the American people. What are the problems, the threats to that? Your listener, I would like you, I'm actually very interested to see if your listener has views on that. I know what I think. I think the biggest source of problems are actually domestic. What am I talking about? I'm talking about economic inequality, vast economic inequality. Haven't seen this since the Gilded Age. Probably worse than in the Gilded Age. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but the percentage of wealth controlled by the richest 1%, it's something like 40%. The percentage of wealth controlled by the bottom 50%, it's like less than 1%. So economic inequality is a big problem. Race is a big problem. The Black Lives Matter movement, the demands coming not only from people of color, but from white people as well, to address the legacy of racism in a decisive way once and for all. I don't think those demands are going to go away. I don't think people are going to say, well, okay, we did our demonstrations in the street, now we're just going to go back to normal. So we need to do something. We need to address that problem. It's a domestic problem. I don't know where you are in climate change. I believe in it. I mean, we're sitting here with this humongous storm that's battering Texas and Louisiana. And that storm has pushed out of the news the unbelievable wildfires that are displacing people in California. And and I know that this has been going on for years now. It gets worse every year. It comes from climate change. We can pretend that it's not real. We can wish it away, but I don't think that's going to work too well. Then you got the pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here we are, the richest country in the world. really believing in our own competence. We think we know how to make things work, how to fix things, and we've got the biggest death toll in the world. So I would argue that the number one of the problems that need solutions is we got to fix our country before we worry about fixing the world. So what's the solution to that? Well, it's all kinds of things. I mean, but what it boils down to is changing our political priorities to pay more attention to the things that threaten Americans where they live, rather than those things that ostensibly threaten us, but actually are occurring on the other side of some ocean. So that's solution number one. I'm not giving you sort of the 10-point plan, but solution number one is let's pay attention to the things that threaten us where we live. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have a foreign policy. It doesn't mean you embrace isolationism. But it does mean, I think, you take a different look at those problems that are coming from abroad, and we adjust our posture accordingly. The U.S. military presence in the Middle East has made things worse.
I think
we set out to pacify, we set out to democratize, we set out to stabilize. We have produced the opposite result. So what do we need to do? Terminate the U.S. military presence in the greater Middle East. And to then see if we can rely on diplomacy to address their problems. What are their problems? Well, problem number one is probably the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Why do we support Saudi Arabia? Do they share our values? No. Do we need their oil? No. So why have we committed ourselves to one side in this historically rooted competition between Persia and Arabia, between Shia and Sunni? What are we doing? So we need to get out of that part of the world, rely on diplomacy to try to help as we can, even though we're not going to have a decisive outcome. As I suggested, we need to get out of Europe because they can manage their own problems. I do think we need to stay militarily in Asia, because were we to pull the plug on the security commitments to Japan and South Korea, and by implication on the rest of the region, I think that would have a destabilizing effect. But to emphasize, all of that is of less importance than addressing the problems that affect Americans where they live here at home. I can't hear you.
That's because my mic was muted, because there's a guy with a leaf blower outside. Yeah, and as soon as we pick an infection, global warming or whatever, then we have similar problems by attacking it, because we're just not good at these multi-system problematic things. Like we had Bjorn Lomborg on the show the other day, and he believes in the climate change and talks about the best way to protect against it is to deal with, reducing poverty. And if you can reduce poverty, people that have money can adapt more easily than folks that don't. People that are not in poverty can pick better power sources to cook their food, to move their vehicles, And so you have, but we can't even agree on that. And then, like you said, with these storms, it just gets so impossibly expensive to deal with, back-to-back hurricanes, wildfires in California.
Well, see, that's an interesting point. I mean, the traditional view of this, I think, is that these are acts of God, as we used to call them, right? And they come as a surprise. And therefore, we sort of accept the notion that we have become comfortable with the notion that there's really nothing much you can do about it other than to, stick a Band-Aid on it when the hemorrhaging starts again. And I think about that, and I get that logic. And then I say, hey, wait a second. This is a country that imagined that it was able to transform the entire Middle East, which was a preposterous notion. But why do we have to accept that there's nothing we can do, let's say with regard to the threat posed by hurricanes, except for wait for the water to come over the dike and evacuate, 500,000 people? Why can we not? And this would require a lot of money, like some of the trillions we wasted in Iraq. Why can't we use technology to have a better early warning system? Not simply early warning as an earlier warning, but more precise warning. If I understand it, in the current hurricane, which hit right near Lake Charles, Louisiana, lots of people were evacuated that actually didn't need to be evacuated because we didn't have the capacity to precisely track where this hurricane was going to go. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a mathematician. I do get a sense that people believe that the more data you have, the more precise you can be in providing answers to questions. Well, I mean, if I were the president of the United States, I would say, look, I don't want any more surprise storms. I want to know precisely when something's going to happen. Now, just because I'm the president doesn't mean I'd snap my fingers and all that would happen. But it seems to me that is the kind of problem that probably has a solution. More precise early warning enables us to be more targeted in our response. And if climate change is going to be causing lots of flooding, then what can we do to reduce it? As I understand it, for example, down in the Gulf Coast, one of the contributing causes to the extent of flooding is the loss of wetlands. Now, the wetlands, again, I'm not a scientist, that the wetlands help to cushion the coast from the effects of large-scale storms. And because of mismanagement, because of building, the wetlands have been reduced. Well, let's restore them. Is that going to cost a lot of money? Yeah. But it costs a lot of money to try to transform Iraq. Again, my point is a policy orientation that addresses threats to Americans where they live. That's the key phrase, where they live. And we don't live in Iraq. And we don't live in Afghanistan. And yet we have a country right now that is like in deep trouble in all kinds of ways. And it seems to me that the policy imperative is to fix what needs to be fixed, even if that requires government authorities to take on issues that heretofore we have tended to shrug off. Well, what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, and I would like to add in solve problems that are reliably solvable and at the lowest level, because federal solutions.
I tend to be with you on that. But there are some problems where the scale is such that it's going to require a federal solution. But by and large, I'm with you. On school policy, on who's wearing masks or what bars and saloons have to be shut down. We don't need decisions like that being made in Washington. They need to be made in towns and in counties and in states.
Yeah, agreed. Just like folks that are concerned about the border that don't live within 2,000 miles of the border, it's hard for them to understand the day-to-day struggles. And that's just one example. That's all over the nation. Let the problems be solved locally,
yes,
regionally, and then if you have a multi-state problem, like a hurricane hits, then yeah, I mean, that's a place where federal assets can be brought in or whatever. I agree.
Right.
What about our partnerships abroad? I mean, do we need to rethink NATO? Do we need to rethink?
We need to get out of NATO.
allies?
We should leave NATO. I was trying to say that. Europe needs to provide for its own security. Do we need partnerships? Yes.
What about like the Five Eyes?
Well, that's
our
useful.
relationship
That's certainly a useful, partnership for intelligence should be maintained. Absolutely. Don't think we need to be in NATO to do that, because Australia and New Zealand are not in NATO, but they're part of the Five Eyes. But what I was going to say is that I've lost track of what I was going to say. So you go ahead and ask a question.
What about Israel? I mean, we did Israel.
Well, okay. No, the question you asked was related to special relationships. We really have two special relationships that stand out. One is with the United Kingdom, and one is with Israel. The one with the United Kingdom really is nostalgic. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill standing arm in arm against the Nazis. And we love to watch TV shows about British aristocrats, Downton Abbey. We have this bizarre fascination with the royal family. What's the latest going on with Meghan and who was it? Harry. Yeah. I don't understand all that. But there's no substantive reason for us to have a closer relationship with the UK than with Brazil. The other country we have a special relationship with is Israel, which stemmed from a time when there was a perception that the survival of Israel was dependent upon support by the United States. That's no longer the case. They're a nuclear power. They're easily the strongest military power in the region. Can you hear that phone?
Yeah, that's all right.
Okay. I think both of those special relationships are obsolete. I don't really believe in special relationships, but I think that the two most important bilateral relationships for the United States of America are with Canada and Mexico. Why? Because we share the continent with them. They are our neighbors. What happens in Canada and in Mexico affects Americans where they live. The Mexican case is obvious, with uncontrolled immigration, with drug cartels. This is a country that needs help. I don't mean that we should embark upon some imperial project of Americanizing Mexico, but their problems are our problems, and they deserve more attention than they should get. Canada is a prosperous, stable democracy, a country with much to admire. They also have some pretty significant sovereignty issues. Because as the Arctic melts, then their ability to control their own borders becomes questionable. We have an interest in preserving the sovereignty of Canada, and that deserves real attention, I think. So if we're going to have a special relationship, I'm voting for a special relationship with our neighbors. Again, why? Because what happens there affects Americans where they live, much more so than what happens in Germany or South Korea or, Botswana.
Yeah, it's again, not to be an isolationist. Gosh, that's hard to say. But when you look at manufacturing of MRAPs, how many do we need? How many invisible jet planes do we need? And the more power you give a president, militarily, the more apt they are to. It's hard to leave them all at Fort Riley, which, by the way, for the audience, is in the middle of it's like the belly button of the country. It's hard to leave them there. You want to use them to create the desire.
You're getting to the question of resources, the distribution of resources. Right. The Pentagon, latest Pentagon budget is what, $780-something billion, but I think everybody agrees that's an undercount, that our total national security spending is probably $1 trillion a year. Are we getting our money's worth? Maybe some people would say, oh, sure, absolutely. I don't think so. And again, of course, we're currently running multi-trillion-dollar deficits. I don't think anybody knows how long that's going to continue. That's another issue nobody talks about. Remember when we used to have two parties? The one party was the tax and spend party,
Yes.
and the other party was supposedly the party of fiscal discipline. Well, man, those days are gone, because it is the former party of fiscal discipline that now is the party that is spending money like there's no tomorrow. I'm an old school guy, so I think that ultimately the books are going to have to balance, and therefore there is a need to set priorities about how to spend the very considerable, but nonetheless not limitless amount of money that we have to spend. And I think the time is for us to spend less on national security, spend more on some of those domestic issues that I was describing a few minutes ago.
When we look at our current presidential climate, and I'm not talking about Joe Biden, I'm talking about the Trump administration, he has said similar things to you. We don't need to be involved in NATO and the UN. They need to pay their share, at least up to the contract level.
Well, and Obama said the same thing about NATO. You know, the notion that they're not paying their share is not, this is not original with Trump.
Right.
This predates Trump.
Right. But where's the follow through? Like where, I mean, is this something that you can just say, if on this date you don't do it, we're out? And should we? And is Donald Trump the guy to
right?
do that?
So as long as we're willing to let them be free riders, they're going to be free riders.
Right.
All right. You know, I think that's human nature, right? If I can get something for free, why would I pay for it? So yes, in a sense, the answer is yes. That we need to say there is a date, but the date is not next Tuesday. The date is probably 10 years from now. That is to say, we say today in 2020, you know, dear European allies, in August of 2030, we're out. Friends, you've got 10 years to figure out how to adjust to the fact that at that point, the United States is no longer going to be your guarantor of security.
Yeah.
I think that would concentrate their minds, and there would be interim steps. So let's say 2 years from now, we will insist that the next Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, the top NATO military, we would insist that he be somebody other than an American. We don't care if it's a Brit, French officer, German, Lithuanian, we don't care. It's not going to be an American. Let's say 4 years from now, we would withdraw all combat ground forces from Europe, out of Germany, out of Poland. 6 years from now, we withdraw all U.S. air forces from Germany, from England, from Italy, from Spain. 8 years from now, we start to pull out all of our logistics support entities. So it doesn't happen overnight, but it happens and gives them plenty of time to figure out how they're going to manage their own affairs. I mean, the way you pose the question, I'm not blaming you for this, but the people are like, what do you want to do? Leave tomorrow? Well, no, that would not be responsible. But just because we can't leave tomorrow doesn't mean we can't leave in a responsible way. That's what needs to be done.
Is there a scenario where we extend that and say, you know, in 10 years, we're going to transition to this point, and then we still want to be your partner, but we're going to redefine
What's
it?
a partner? What do you mean partner?
Well, the relationship is 50 plus years old. Do we need to redefine it in some way that's more?
But I don't know what you mean. No, but the relationship is a relationship of security dependence.
Uh-huh.
And I'm saying that relationship has become obsolete. It's not necessary. Does that mean we're not going to be friends? No. Does that mean Americans can't go vacation in France or Scotland? No, of course they can't. Does that mean we're not going to buy German automobiles? Of course we're going to buy German automobiles. But it doesn't mean we have to guarantee their security. That we're going to make them act like normal nations.
What about our media? I mean, we seem to present these stories where gosh, and I'm going to open the can of worms here, but like during the worst part of the Syrian thing, where people were getting on flotillas and trying to go across the Mediterranean Sea, and we're just desperate because we see kids being blown up, but we really don't care. We really don't want to send our people there. We don't want to spend $1 trillion. How do we wean ourselves off of this constant need as a nation? I'm not talking nonprofit. I'm not talking extra, outside of the government. But how do we wean ourselves off of these desires to go respond to every tragedy, even though we have no effective means to,
Well, I
make
mean, it's a very general question. I mean, if we're talking about these desperate people trying to escape unspeakable conditions, we should do what we can do.
Yeah.
Now, what's that? Give money to the United Nations and other relief agencies to try to provide for some amount of care in these horrible refugee camps. That's not a lot, but it's not nothing. But then the larger question is, how much do we care?
Right.
And there, I think we have to confront the possibility that if we really cared, we'd let them come here. I mean, that we have a big country. Best I can tell, we're not overpopulated. There's lots of places that are underpopulated. There's some places that are becoming depopulated. I guess if you're in Dakotas or something. We're not going to invite every refugee in the world to come to the United States. But is it not at least possible that we could be more generous and more forthcoming? Do our share? Make all the other nations that aren't doing their share feel guilty about it? To shame them into doing something more? The Germans admitted 1 million refugees. What was it, like 2 years ago, when the crisis of people crossing the Mediterranean was at its height? Chancellor Merkel was roundly denounced. I don't know enough to know how that has panned out. I suspect that the rise of the what's it called, the AfD, alternative for Germany, probably to some degree stimulated by anger at the number of refugees. But it hasn't, overturned the political order there. And from a moral perspective, Merkel did a very good thing. Again, I'm not trying to say that every refugee there gets a free ticket, a free flight to Kennedy Airport.
Right.
I am saying that we probably could, if we want to have a serious effect on the status of these poor people, we probably can have that effect by being more generous in offering sanctuary than in, invading some country because we think we're going to transform it. I'm going to have to go here pretty soon.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Yeah, I wanted to wrap up with that question. It's fantastic. It's a great conversation. Thank you so much. Everybody should check out Andrew's book. You can go to Amazon and get all kinds of books that he's written. You can always check him out on BU's website. The links for all those things will be in the show. I think it's great to have these conversations because they're ranging, but they illustrate the complexities that we're trying to deal with. And when we have two presidents that are running, and you look and you go, which one of these people are talking about these things? You don't often hear that because it's just there are too many interests involved in other interests, and and it draws away from our ability to do to do less and accomplish more. I guess.
Well, thanks for having me on this. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Let me sign off here. Hold on one sec.